Real quick, what are we looking at right here? If we believe Crusader Kings 3, we have before us 4 kingdoms that happen to be ruled by the same family, the Carolingians. They used to be an empire, but they aren't one anymore, which brings us to the question whether that is actually true. The answer? Well, it's complicated. The Carolingian Empire is a perfect test case for one obvious question. Just how accurately does Crusader Kings 3 depict the past? We will begin with exploring how the empire got itself into the position it is in 867, before we explore the relations the 4 kings have and how it is all depicted in the game. After this video, you will know what the game gets right, where it simplifies things too much, and how to approach the region with a better sense of its historical reality when you play. The Empire of 867 is only a shadow of its former self. Much has changed since Charlemagne was crowned emperor in the year 800. For one, new outside forces have risen. While the Umayyads of Iberia were well past their height, struggling with their own rebellions, the Slavic tribes to the east and lately the Norsemen have found a wealthy and squishy target in the lands of the empire. Soon, the Magyars would arrive in Pannonia and start a century of raids and tribute payments throughout the empire. What's more, the preceding decades have also been difficult internally. Charlemagne's son, Louis the Pious, governed a unified empire, but faced heavy infighting and opposition from his sons. The reason for rebellion? Inheritance. Carolingian inheritance practices are a complex mess and require a lot of reading to fully grasp the cultural ins and outs, but really the problem can be described in simple terms. In the year 817, Louis the Pious decreed with the consent of his magnates that the empire and emperorship should remain indivisible. This meant that rather than all sons being independent kings after Louis's death, the younger sons would be sub-kings underneath the oldest son Lothar, who would rule as emperor. His younger sons, Ludwig the German among them, ruler of East Francia in 867, may have had reason to be uneasy about this decision. But the idea of an indivisible imperial authority had become a powerful paradigm within the Carolingian court and church. The ideal of empire was deeply shaped by Frankish ecclesiastical thought and independent of its secular ideas of kingdom. Archbishop Agobard of Lyon, for example, became one of the foremost proponents of the principle that one faith and one church should be protected by one empire under one supreme ruler. For the Carolingians, emperorship was therefore less closely tied to possession of one precisely defined territory than to responsibility for the unity and protection of the Christian people, or, more accurately, the Christian community that they regarded as orthodox, their very own Carolingian right. The settlement presented the subordinate kingdoms of the younger sons as components of a single imperial order under Emperor Lothar. Issued with the formal consent of leading magnates and bishops, this settlement could claim both political and religious legitimacy. This means that even ambitious sons therefore had to portray themselves as acting within the Christian and imperial order. Otherwise, they would have risked appearing unworthy of support from the magnates whose consent made effective rule possible. For a long time, historians assumed that this consent mattered relatively little. Charlemagne, the argument went, had been successful because he exercised near total control, while later kingdoms and iterations of the Frankish Empire weakened because self-interested aristocrats undermined royal authority. That interpretation still survives in pop history, but scholarship long has found a more nuanced picture. Charlemagne's strength did not rest on ruling without the magnates, but on repeatedly securing and directing their consent. Consent mattered under Charlemagne, just as it would under his successors. While the realm's magnates supported the partition plans of 817, they did not support what was to follow. In the 830s, Louis sought to include his last-born son from his second marriage in this testament. You may know this son as the King of West Francia in 867, Charles the Bald. It was at this point that his older sons staged rebellions, supported by the magnates and much of the church. Needing to share their inheritance even further was simply too much and risked the integrity of the empire. Now in open rebellion against the one emperor Louis the Pious, Lothar actually presented himself plainly as protector of imperial unity by ousting a misguided father and instituting a just emperor's rule in his stead. What followed, predictably, was a period of chaos. Louis the Pious gathered an army, as did his sons, and they met on the Rotfeld near Colmar in 833. Instead of a battle, they found negotiations, and bit by bit, supporters of Louis the Pious left his camp and sided with his sons. Finally, the emperor told his last supporters to leave camp also, where he would seek surrender in front of his sons. The Rotfeld earned the nickname Field of Lies thereafter from Louis' supporters. Much to nobody's surprise, of course, the victory did not bring lasting peace whatsoever, and the victorious sons soon had a falling out as well, as Lothar sought more authority than they were willing to consent to. Their pact was born out of self-interest and ended through self-interest. Before long, the temporarily deposed and humiliated Louis had been placed onto the throne of the empire once more. When he finally died in 840, his three surviving sons, Lothar, Ludwig the German, and Charles the Bald, fought amongst themselves yet again. After his father had died, Emperor Lothar attempted to revive and enforce the imperial superiority originally promised for him in 817. 3 years after his father's death, in 843, the brothers settled on the Treaty of Verdun. Now here is where it gets interesting. The Treaty of Verdun did not create 3 modern independent states, but it did establish 3 autonomous and essentially coordinate Carolingian kingdoms. Lothar retained the imperial title, seniority, and ceremonial precedence. Yet Ludwig and Charles neither became his sub-kings nor acknowledged an effective imperial jurisdiction over their realms. These conflicts over independence, empire, and inheritance define the political situation that leads to 867. To depict this period properly, CK3 would have to treat the Carolingians as one political family, whose kingdoms were divided but not yet fully separate. They lived in the very same political sphere. Let's see whether it does. For East and West Francia, things are relatively simple to explain. In the 840s, Charles the Bald and Ludwig the German swore an oath to one another in front of their respective followers while they were battling their brother Lothar. Even more remarkable, their followers also swore their own oaths, indicating that follower consent yet again mattered. The Oaths of Strasbourg, as they are called, tied them together in their struggles against their older brother and Emperor Lothar. While this pact did unify them against their common foe and allowed them to acquire independence from Emperor Lothar as discussed, it too did not outlast its immediate purpose. By the 850s, some magnates of West Francia and Aquitaine sent for Ludwig, offering him the crown to rid themselves of Charles the Bald. Initially, Ludwig sent his son, also named Ludwig, to take an army and win the crown, but the campaign went nowhere. A few years later, Ludwig the German himself made for West Francia once more at the behest of the West Francian magnates, but yet again did not find enough support for ousting his brother while there, and had to retreat. Finally, the two half-brothers and kings signed a treaty of peace in the year 860. Their peace in 867 in the start date is entirely practical. If they could, they would oust one another. They simply don't have the option. In the game, we do see some glimpses of this tumultuous relationship. Ludwig and Charles share a rivalry with one another, which explicitly is justified with Ludwig's attempts to relieve Charles of his crown in the game's scripts. Both also have a number of claims on each other and the rest of the Carolingian realm, but there is no specific content around their past Strasbourg oaths, their respective legitimacy, or regarding their recent squabbles and the ultimate peace treaty. Similarly, they also cannot collude to, for example, split Lotharingia between them, as they did historically in 870. The game simply lacks any mechanics for it. Factions can be founded to place the other brother on the respective throne, but the AI will always refuse joining a potential claimant war for their own claim. This is especially disappointing given how significant these claim wars actually were between Ludwig and Charles prior to the game start. So in essence, as far as West and East Francia are concerned, CK3 recognizes that Ludwig and Charles were rivals, but not that they were rivals operating within the same Carolingian political order. This brings us directly to the other two realms that we have to discuss here. Emperor Lothar, who had stirred up much of the trouble of the preceding decades, died in 855. By 867, Lotharingia and Italy are ruled by the two surviving sons of Emperor Lothar, so by the nephews of Ludwig the German and Charles the Bald. Louis of Italy is the older son, and with that also emperor, although his effective authority is concentrated overwhelmingly in Italy and is incredibly weak north of the Alps. At the start of the game, Louis is campaigning in southern Italy, hoping to subdue the Lombard lords, the Muslim Aghlabids, and maintain his recognition as Imperator Romanorum from the Eastern Roman Empire. These campaigns would achieve some progress, but they would also keep him preoccupied far away from the former core of the Frankish Empire, and open him up to attacks from his own family. Once, when a rumor made people believe that Louis of Italy had died in Benevento, Ludwig the German and Charles the Bald, so both of his uncles, readied their troops, evidently in a contest to acquire Italy and emperorship as swiftly as they could. The same dynamic would appear again when Louis's brother, King Lothar II of Lotharingia, died in 869, so only 2 years after the start date. His uncles Charles the Bald and Ludwig the German asserted themselves before the Lotharingian magnates to see the kingdom of Lotharingia split between them. In truth, Emperor Louis would have been the legal heir to his brother's lands, but his absence meant that he had little say in the matter. Louis very much utilized imperial structures of governance in Italy and sought to turn Italy itself into a renewed imperial stronghold, but ultimately he lost in two ways. Not only did he not receive the territory north of the Alps that should have belonged to him, but he also failed to restore his empire south of the Alps. Speaking of failure, Louis's brother, Lothar II of Lotharingia, was even less fortunate. He mismanaged his realm for years, only to die, as mentioned, 2 years after game start, with his kingdom immediately evaporating between his uncles. Lothar, in many ways, was pretty much your average CK3 player. Everything he went through, you can go through yourself. He had gotten into a long fight with the church to divorce his wife Teutberga, and even accused her of an incestuous relationship with her brother to get the divorce granted. His contemporaries largely recognized the accusations as shameful fabrications. They viewed it as an abuse of his royal power. He had attacked his wife's reputation merely to marry his lover and legitimize his bastard children. This reprehensible behavior brought many of the Lotharingian magnates to question their support of his kingship and drew the ire of the Pope himself. Ultimately, his rule in Lotharingia was a complete failure, seeing the Lotharingian magnates steadily gain more authority that would long outlast him, while he left no legitimate heir behind. Lothar II is actually represented surprisingly well, only equipped with bastards, a wife that hates him, and a lover that everyone already knows about. So, what is the verdict? The Carolingian Empire in 867 has an emperor in name only and 2 uncles that would love to unify it under themselves, or at least make off like thieves with as many pieces as they can. The gameplay reality is that most of these intricacies here are not depicted in Crusader Kings 3. Certainly, the characters are all present, have claims on each other, and CK3 is so chaotic that people can die regularly enough to lead to wild inheritance cascades. So, to be clear, playing here is fun and the broad strokes of the Empire are all present. However, there are some massive discrepancies. For one, Louis II is only a king, not an emperor. While it is of course true that he had virtually no sway and authority over the other kings governing the regions of the empire, his title still mattered. The title did give him ceremonial precedence and a stronger ideological basis for presenting interventions as imperial responsibilities. He intervened heavily in Roman affairs in a way a mere king of Italy could not have justified it. The imperial dignity, even after all the trials and tribulations, simply still carried weight. This is self-evident from the fact that both Ludwig, in the name of his son Carloman, and Charles the Bald hurried for Italy when Emperor Louis II finally did actually die in 875. You might notice that this is only 8 years after the start date. Many of the Carolingians just died very swiftly. While Carloman was actually designated by Louis II as his heir, Charles the Bold secured papal support and enough backing among Italian magnates to succeed and defeat Carloman's competing claim. If the imperial title truly had faded, if the concept didn't mean anything anymore, they wouldn't have been this concerned with claiming it. Another instance here is that Ludwig's thirdborn, Charles the Fat, would actually eventually even become the last emperor of a truly unified Carolingian realm, only losing it as a unified entity when it turned out that his rule had largely been a failure and the magnates rescinded their consent. If you, in-game, inherit Italy, the imperial title does not come with it. As such, Italy and Louis' titles are no different from, say, taking East Francia off of Ludwig the German. What's more, the family often negotiated with one another, mediated conflicts, and even exchanged lands when necessary. Crusader Kings 3 accurately describes the practiced form of inheritance of the Carolingians as confederate partition, but in practice doesn't make it feel like the resulting situation could be described as a confederation at all. In the early 10th century, Lotharingian magnates transferred their allegiance first westward and then eastward with relative ease. Technically, it is all Francia. Neither is this a possibility, nor can realms such as Lotharingia be split between 2 contesting Carolingian rulers in an amicable treaty. We can press claims, and vassals can start a faction to put one of the other Carolingians onto their liege's throne, but there is no bespoke mechanic to truly mimic history. What's more, the Carolingian family is led by Charles the Bold of West Francia as the househead. However, this really shouldn't be the case. Emperor Louis, after all, carries the imperial dignity. The househead mechanic itself is not entirely historically traceable or real, but with the way it works, Louis should also be the one to hold that title. He is from a younger generation than Charles the Bold, of course, but he is also from the primary stem of the family tree, since he is Emperor Lothar's son. So, he should probably also be the one in charge if anybody has to be. In general, the Carolingians probably should not be able to create their own cadet branches until the empire has fallen well and truly apart, as it removes them from each other's influence as househead. Continuing with the theme of the game getting inheritances wrong, a vital flaw is that Crusader Kings 3 grants women the right to inheritance as well for the Carolingian Empire. This simply wasn't the case. Women themselves were not eligible to hold royal titles on their own. After our start date, the Carolingian dynasty went through a cascade of inheritances as its leading male members died for one reason or another. In real life, this swiftly unified the empire once more, even if only for a very short time. In CK3, this would simply place independent queens on the throne and, one generation later, a totally different dynasty. You can also not create testaments. Carolingian rulers took this step to secure their heirs' future rule both legally, but also in the eyes of their powerful magnates. Such arrangements were a source of many years of strife, as we saw earlier. Over the years, CK3 has at least gotten better about this. You can, for example, name co-monarchs to cement one of your sons as heir, but the game still falls short of the shenanigans the Carolingians really undertook. Additionally, while pop history mostly remembers what would become Germany as developing an elective system culminating in the Holy Roman Empire, this too wasn't really the case. Factually, we can see elective, or rather consent-based selection of the next heir for virtually all rulers in this period, Carolingian or otherwise. CK3 does have a feudal elective title law, but it doesn't automatically get applied anywhere outside of you reforming the Holy Roman Empire. A cruder version are factions, which is at least worth a mention, but as those virtually always guarantee a military rebellion, they aren't quite the same, as for example the Italian magnates' recognition of Charles the Bald instead of Karlmann. This wasn't a military rebellion against an already established king, they simply pledged and selected a different one. Lastly, while you can reform the Carolingian Empire after you forcefully conquer it, there is no way to reinforce imperial authority through cooperation, or other, more elegant ways of coercion through diplomacy. Realistically, a total displacement of Carolingian relatives wasn't always necessary. They often simply sought to reintegrate them as sub-kings. So, long story short, did the Carolingian Empire still exist? Well, no, not as one effectively governed realm, but neither were its kingdom's four unrelated states. CK3 depicts the division, while losing the still existing idea and title of empire that connected all of the pieces together. CK3 has the basic features to bring action and jealousy into the Carolingian Empire, but it lacks much of what defined the period that follows after 867. It is an okay, rudimentary depiction, but needs many more elements to become truly authentic. Compared with CK3 at launch, and especially with CK2, the region has improved considerably. Beigard alone will give the church the important part of Frankish rulership it did occupy, but it will need testaments, more interesting factions, and allegiance shifts to really capture the historical essence of the region. If you want to learn more about medieval political practice and see how it is depicted in CK3, check out the video on East Francia and its neighbors. For now, however, I will leave you right here. I will see you later, Alligator.